The aircraft emerged from the long southern night into a world without contrast. Below, the frozen surface of the Ross Sea merged seamlessly with the low cloud ceiling, erasing the horizon line that normally anchors human perception. White dissolved into white. Sky and ground became indistinguishable planes of pale light. There was no shadow, no depth, no visible slope, only a featureless expanse stretching toward the interior of Antarctica. Inside the cabin, passengers moved quietly between windows, cameras raised, voices subdued by the awareness that they were witnessing a landscape few people would ever see. The flight had departed hours earlier from Auckland on a routine sightseeing route operated by Air New Zealand. For 2 years, these journeys had been marketed as safe, carefully planned excursions to the edge of the world. The aircraft would descend over notable landmarks, circle slowly, then return north before the polar weather could shift. At the front of the aircraft, the cockpit windows framed a diffused glow rather than a view. The crew relied primarily on instruments. Outside references were unreliable here. Antarctica did not behave like other continents. Light scattered across ice crystals in the atmosphere, flattening the landscape into a deceptive uniformity known among polar aviators as sector whiteout. Ahead lay Ross Island, though it could not yet be seen. Rising from that island was a mountain unlike any other in the region, a massive volcanic cone, permanently snow-covered, emitting a faint plume even in still air. To navigators, it was a prominent landmark. To those without visual cues, it was simply another elevation hidden within the same monochrome field. Mount Erebus stood directly along the aircraft's track. The descent began gradually, controlled and deliberate. There was no sense of urgency. The aircraft was functioning normally. Navigation systems indicated the planned route. Altitude readings were stable. Communications with Antarctic air traffic services were routine, almost procedural in tone. What could not be measured by instruments was perception. From the cockpit, the terrain ahead appeared flat, a continuous white plain extending to the horizon. The visual illusion was powerful. Without shadows or contrast, the human eye interpreted the distant rising slope of Ross Island as level ground. The mountain's mass blended perfectly into the sky behind it. Passengers on the left side of the cabin leaned closer to their windows. Some later photographs would show an empty whiteness where a mountain large enough to dominate an entire region should have been visible. Cameras captured light, not shape. The aircraft continued descending. 4 engines produced a steady, reassuring hum, a sound associated with stability, reliability, routine operation. Nothing in that sound suggested proximity to terrain. Nothing in the cabin indicated danger. Flight attendants moved calmly through the aisle, pointing out features barely visible through the haze. Far below, the ice surface rose to meet the aircraft, though no one aboard perceived the closing distance. In polar regions, scale becomes meaningless. Without trees, buildings, or shadows, altitude can be misjudged by thousands of feet. Even experienced pilots must trust instruments over instinct. But trust depends on the accuracy of the information being provided. Unseen within the aircraft's navigation system was a subtle error, a discrepancy in program coordinates that had shifted the intended route closer to the mountainous interior of Ross Island. It was not a dramatic deviation. It did not trigger alarms. It existed quietly, buried in data entered before departure. The crew believed they were over open terrain. The aircraft descended through 6,000 feet. Cloud layers thinned momentarily, revealing a brighter surface below. To the eye, it resembled a flat snowfield. In reality, it was the upper slopes of a volcano rising more than 12,000 feet above sea level. There was still time, but only if the illusion could be broken. The first ground proximity warning sounded only seconds before impact. A mechanical voice cut through the cockpit, abrupt and unmistakable. Until that moment, there had been no visual confirmation of danger. What followed was immediate action, not panic. Trained responses executed within an impossibly short window. Outside, the white landscape remained unchanged. From a distance, there was no visible movement, no explosion of color, no dramatic signal. Just a brief interruption in the uniform stillness of Antarctica, quickly swallowed by weather and distance. Silence returned to the continent as if nothing had happened. Hours later, search aircraft would struggle to locate the site in the same disorienting conditions. Even knowing where to look did not guarantee visibility. Antarctica concealed the event beneath layers of ice, cloud, and shifting light. The mountain remained where it had stood for millennia, indifferent, unmoved, its slopes blending again into the pale horizon. The disaster was not the result of a single mistake. It was a convergence of environment, assumption, procedure, and perception, a chain of small factors aligning in the most unforgiving place on Earth. In the years that followed, the flight will become one of aviation's most studied examples of controlled flight into terrain. Not because the aircraft failed, but because it did not. Everything worked. Until it didn't. In the late 1970s, commercial aviation had entered an era of confidence. Jet travel had become routine across much of the world. Aircraft were larger, more reliable, and capable of distances that only a generation earlier had belonged to military operations. Airlines began exploring routes not strictly defined by transportation needs, but by experience. Among the most ambitious of these was the idea of sightseeing flights to the most remote continent on Earth. For a nation geographically close to the southern latitudes, the concept held particular appeal. New Zealand's isolation had always shaped its identity, and Antarctica lay closer to its shores than to any other populated region. Scientific missions had long departed from Christchurch toward the ice, but the notion of civilian passengers making the journey as observers rather than researchers was new. New Zealand introduced its Antarctic sightseeing program in 1977. The flights were carefully marketed as safe, controlled excursions. Passengers would board a long-range jet in Auckland, travel south for several hours, descend over the continent to view significant landmarks, then return the same day. There would be no landing on the ice. The aircraft would remain airborne at all times, following a route designed to avoid hazardous terrain while providing dramatic views. The aircraft chosen for the operation was the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, one of the most advanced wide-body airliners of its time. Designed for transoceanic travel, it possessed the range, stability, and redundancy required for extended operations over remote regions where diversion airports did not exist. Inside the cabin, the experience was unlike conventional airline travel. Windows were unobstructed by wing placement in many seating sections. Flight attendants acted partly as guides, pointing out glacier, research stations, and mountain ranges. Pilots occasionally descended to lower altitudes than typical cruise levels to improve visibility, always within safety margins defined by navigation charts. Over 2 years, multiple flights completed the journey without incident. Success reinforced confidence. Each mission followed a route across the Southern Ocean toward the Ross Dependency, the sector of Antarctica administered by New Zealand. From there, the aircraft would approach Ross Island, a region containing both American research facilities and some of the continent's most striking geological features. Among them was the towering volcanic formation of Mount Erebus. Rising more than 12,000 feet above sea level, it was the southernmost active volcano on Earth. Its presence provided a dramatic focal point for sightseeing flights. Weather permitting, aircraft could circle the mountain, offering passengers a rare aerial view of its crater and the surrounding ice shelf. To make such operations feasible, precise navigation was essential. Unlike routes over populated continents, there were no ground-based radio beacons across most of Antarctica. Crews relied heavily on inertial navigation systems, self-contained units that calculated position based on gyroscopic sensors and program coordinates. Before departure, flight planners entered a sequence of latitude and longitude points defining the intended track. Once airborne, the system guided the aircraft automatically from waypoint to waypoint. Accuracy depended entirely on the correctness of those coordinates. In the case of Antarctic sightseeing flights, the planned route was designed to pass east of Ross Island over open water and low-lying ice before turning south toward McMurdo Sound. This path provided scenic views while maintaining safe clearance from mountainous terrain obscured by weather. Charts indicated minimum safe altitudes for each segment. Crews were briefed accordingly. The flights operated under visual flight rules during the low-altitude sightseeing phase, meaning pilots relied on direct observation of terrain to maintain safe separation. In most environments, this posed little risk. Landforms provide contrast, shadows, and recognizable features that allow accurate judgment of distance. Antarctica was different. Meteorologists and polar explorers had long documented optical phenomena unique to the region. Flat light conditions could eliminate shadows entirely. Snow-covered slopes could appear horizontal. Depth perception could collapse, making large objects seem distant or invisible against similarly colored backgrounds. These effects were known hazards, but they were also intermittent. Previous flights had encountered clear weather, offering spectacular visibility across hundreds of miles. Such experiences shaped expectations for subsequent missions. By November 1979, the program had acquired an aura of routine. Passengers booked seats months in advance. Media coverage portrayed the journeys as extraordinary but safe. For many aboard the final flight, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to witness a continent inaccessible to ordinary tourism. Few considered the fragility of the operation's assumptions. Behind the scenes, a small administrative change had occurred in the flight planning system. Coordinates defining the route near Ross Island were updated, a modification intended to improve navigational accuracy. The change shifted the program track several miles west, closer to the mountainous interior of the island. The update was entered into the company's computer system the night before the flight. What did not occur was a comprehensive briefing to the crew scheduled to fly the route the following morning. To them, the path remained as described in earlier documentation, a safe corridor over relatively flat terrain. Charts, notes, and verbal briefings reinforced that understanding. Nothing indicated that the aircraft's inertial navigation system would guide them toward higher ground than expected. In aviation, hazards rarely arise from a single dramatic error. More often, they emerge from subtle misalignments, small discrepancies between assumption and reality that accumulate unnoticed. On the morning of November 28, 1979, the DC-10 departed Auckland carrying 257 passengers and crew. Weather forecasts suggested acceptable conditions over the Ross Sea region, though cloud layers and flat light were anticipated. Such forecasts were typical for Antarctic operations. The aircraft climbed southward into clear skies, leaving behind the populated landscapes of New Zealand for the vast emptiness of the Southern Ocean. Hours later, as the continent came into view, the success of previous flights created a sense of familiarity. Procedures had worked before. Navigation systems had performed reliably. The aircraft itself was considered among the safest in service. Confidence can be as influential as caution. Approaching Antarctica, the crew prepared for descent to sightseeing altitude, expecting to encounter the sweeping white plains described in their briefings. Instruments guided them steadily along the programmed route, a route they believed would keep them clear of significant terrain. Far ahead, hidden by cloud and optical illusion, Ross Island waited. The stage had been set not by a single decision, but by a chain of ordinary actions: scheduling, programming, briefing, expectation. Each step appeared reasonable in isolation. Together, They created a pathway toward a place where routine aviation practices will be tested against one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The passengers gathered at the windows as the first glimpses of ice appeared below, unaware that the margin for error had. Complex accidents rarely originate in a single place. They form at the intersection of machine capability, human judgment, environmental conditions, and organizational structure. Each element may function normally on its own. Risk emerges when their margins overlap. On November 28, 1979, four such elements converged over the southern reaches of the world. The aircraft assigned to the flight was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10-30, a tree-jet designed for long-haul international routes. It represented the technological confidence of its era, a wide body capable of carrying hundreds of passengers across oceans without refueling. 3 high-bypass turbofan engines provided both power and redundancy. Hydraulic systems were triplicated. Electrical supply pathways were laid to ensure continuity even in abnormal situations. Structurally, the aircraft was built to withstand severe turbulence and extreme cold at altitude. For navigation, it relied on an inertial navigation system, or INS. Unlike modern satellite-based positioning, the INS did not reference external signals. Instead, it used gyroscopes and accelerometers to track movement from a known starting point. Once aligned on the ground, it continuously calculated the aircraft position relative to program coordinates. The system was remarkably precise for its time, but only if the initial data were correct. Terrain awareness technology was limited by contemporary standards. Ground proximity warning systems existed, but provided alerts only when closure rates and altitude thresholds indicated imminent danger. They did not display terrain maps or predictive pathways. In clear conditions, visual awareness compensated for these limitations. In Antarctica, visual awareness could not be assumed. The cockpit crew comprised experienced airline pilots with thousands of flight hours between them. They were trained for international operations, accustomed to managing complex aircraft systems, and familiar with long-duration flights over remote regions. However, Antarctic operations required a specialized understanding not typically encountered on standard routes. Polar navigation introduces unique challenges. Magnetic compasses become unreliable near the poles. Radio navigation aids are sparse, and weather systems behave differently than in temperate zones. Visual illusions caused by snow cover and low-angle sunlight can distort perception in ways unfamiliar to pilots trained primarily in conventional environments. The crew had studied procedures for the sightseeing route and relied on company briefings describing expected conditions and terrain clearance. Trust in those briefings was a rational professional choice. Airline operations depend on accurate information flow between planners and flight crews. When the chain functions properly, pilots can focus on execution rather than verification of every underlying assumption. On this flight, the chain contained a hidden fracture. The environment. Antarctica is not simply cold. It is optically deceptive. Snow and ice surfaces reflect light in a diffuse manner, scattering illumination across the atmosphere. When cloud cover filters sunlight evenly, shadows disappear. Without shadows, the human brain loses critical depth cues used to interpret terrain. This phenomenon, flat light, can transform mountains into featureless shapes. Slopes appear level. Distance becomes difficult to judge. Objects blend into the background until they are dangerously close. Another condition, known as sector whiteout, occurs when overcast skies merge visually with snow-covered ground. The horizon vanishes entirely. Pilots can no longer distinguish up from down through external reference alone. Instrument flight procedures normally mitigate such hazards, but sightseeing operations often involve descending below cloud layers to provide passengers with unobstructed views. On the day of the flight, Meteorological reports indicated cloud cover over Ross Island with areas of reduced contrast, conditions capable of producing severe visual illusions. To an observer unfamiliar with polar environments, the landscape might appear calm, even benign. In reality, it concealed vertical relief on a massive scale. Systems and organization. Behind the aircraft and crew stood a larger structure, the airline's operational system. Flight planners prepared routes, calculated fuel requirements, assessed weather forecasts, and programmed navigation coordinates into company computers. Dispatchers coordinated with air traffic authorities. Maintenance teams ensured the aircraft's readiness. Each role operated within established procedures developed through years of experience. Shortly before the flight, planners adjusted coordinates defining the route near Ross Island. The modification aligned the path more closely with a navigational reference point, but inadvertently shifted it toward higher terrain. The change was subtle, only a few degrees of latitude and longitude. On paper, it appeared minor. In practice, it redirected the aircraft toward the slopes of Mount Erebus instead of the open water corridor originally intended. Critically, the update was not clearly communicated to the flight crew. The coordinates loaded into the aircraft's inertial navigation system reflected the revised route. The crew's briefing materials reflected the previous one. Both sources appeared authoritative. Neither alone revealed the discrepancy. Air traffic control monitoring in Antarctica was limited. Radar coverage did not extend across the region. Controllers relied on position reports transmitted by the aircraft itself, trusting onboard navigation to maintain separation from terrain. Thus, no external system was positioned to detect the developing hazard. Alignment. By the time the aircraft approached Ross Island, all four elements had aligned. A highly capable aircraft operating normally, a professional crew executing a routine sightseeing descent, an environment capable of masking terrain completely, a navigational pathway shifted toward a mountain the crew did not expect to encounter. None of these factors alone guaranteed disaster. Together, they removed layers of protection that aviation normally depends upon. The DC-10 descended steadily, guided by instruments that reflected programmed data rather than physical reality. Outside the cockpit, the white landscape offered no contradiction. Inside, the crew saw no indication that the aircraft was on a collision course with rising ground. The illusion was not merely visual, it was systemic. Aviation safety relies on redundancy, multiple independent barriers preventing a single error from becoming catastrophic. On this day, those barriers failed sequentially, not through dramatic malfunction but through quiet misalignment. As the aircraft continued southward, the margin between expectation and reality narrowed to seconds. By early afternoon Antarctic time, the aircraft had begun its descent toward the Ross region. The transition from cruise altitude to sightseeing level followed standard procedure. Power settings were reduced gradually. The nose lowered almost imperceptibly. Inside the cabin, the change was felt only as a slight shift in engine tone, a deeper, quieter hum as the aircraft traded altitude for proximity to the landscape passengers had come to see. Cloud layers hung over the area in broad, uniform sheets. Breaks appeared intermittently, revealing flashes of white surface below. The light filtering through the overcast sky erased contrast, creating the flat illumination characteristic of polar regions. The crew believed they were approaching open terrain east of Ross Island. In reality, the inertial navigation system guided them toward the island itself, toward rising ground concealed by optical illusion. The descent continued through 16,000 feet. At that altitude, terrain clearance should have been ample. Charts indicated that the intended route passed over low-lying ice shelves and sea ice. Nothing in the crew's expectations suggested the presence of a mountain exceeding 12,000 feet in elevation directly ahead. Outside the cockpit windows, the view remained deceptively calm. a pale surface stretched to the horizon, appearing almost level with the aircraft's flight path. There were no visible ridges, no shadows defining slopes, no texture to indicate elevation. The upper slopes of Mount Erebus blended seamlessly into the sky. Passengers gathered at the windows, many unaware that they were looking not at distant plains but at the flanks of a volcano rising steadily toward them. Cameras captured the scene as a continuous white field, an image that would later confound investigators attempting to understand how such terrain could remain unseen. The aircraft descended through 10,000 feet. At this stage of the flight, the crew prepared to level off at a lower altitude for sightseeing. Communication with Antarctic air traffic authorities remained routine. No warnings were issued. Controllers had no radar picture, no terrain monitoring capability, and no reason to suspect the aircraft was off its expected track. In the cockpit, instruments displayed normal parameters: airspeed, altitude, engine performance, all within limits. Navigation indications confirmed alignment with the programmed route. Trust in the system remained intact. Below 6,000 feet, the margin for error diminished rapidly. The illusion of flat terrain persisted. Without visual cues, the human brain interpreted the rising slope as horizontal. The aircraft descent profile appeared appropriate for the expected environment. There was no immediate trigger for suspicion. Then, within seconds, the ground proximity warning system activated. A Sinzai's voice cut through the cockpit. Terrain. Pull up. The alert indicated imminent collision with terrain, a scenario that contradicted everything the crew believed about their position. For a brief instant, confusion replaced routine. Recognition followed almost immediately. Power levers advanced forward. The aircraft's nose began to rise. The engines responded with a surge of thrust, the sound echoing through the fuselage as the crew attempted an emergency climb. But physics imposed its own timeline. At the aircraft's speed and altitude, the available distance to clear the terrain was insufficient. Even with maximum thrust, the climb rate could not overcome the closing slope ahead. Outside, the white surface resolved into texture only at the final moment, a wall of snow-covered rock filling the windscreen as the illusion collapsed into reality. Impact occurred at high speed on the lower slopes of the mountain. There was no extended sequence of evasive maneuvering, no prolonged struggle. The transition from control flight to collision lasted seconds. The aircraft remained structurally intact until the moment of impact, engines producing power, controls responding, a functioning machine meeting immovable terrain. The remote location ensured that no immediate rescue was possible. The force of the collision scattered debris across the ice-covered slope, leaving a scar visible only from the air. Above, cloud layers closed again, obscuring the sight. In the silence that followed, Antarctica returned to its indifferent stillness. Wind carried fine snow across the mountainside, gradually softening the sharp outlines of wreckage. Far away, communication centers waited for the routine position reports that would not come. When contact was lost, uncertainty prevailed at first. Radio blackouts were not uncommon in polar regions. Navigation delays could occur. Controllers attempted repeated calls on multiple frequencies, hoping for a response. None came. Hours passed before the scale of the situation became apparent. Search aircraft dispatched from New Zealand and Antarctic bases encountered the same disorienting conditions that had concealed the mountain from the doomed flight. Locating the site required persistence and favorable breaks in the weather. Eventually, a reconnaissance aircraft sighted debris on the slopes of Ross Island. The location confirmed what had seemed improbable. A modern jetliner, operating normally, had flown directly into a mountain that should have been visible for miles. The accident represented one of aviation's most devastating examples of controlled flight into terrain, a collision not with an unseen obstacle, but with a known landmark rendered invisible by environment, expectation, and subtle navigational error. In the immediate hours after contact was lost, uncertainty dominated official response. Aircraft operating in polar regions could experience communication interruptions without incident. Atmospheric conditions interfered with radio transmission. Navigation systems occasionally required recalibration. Controllers and airline officials initially considered the possibility of equipment malfunction rather than catastrophe. As time passed without any position reports, concern deepened. Search operations began from multiple points across the southern Pacific. Long-range aircraft departed New Zealand carrying crews trained for maritime reconnaissance. From within Antarctica, American personnel stationed near McMurdo Sound prepared support flights despite worsening weather conditions. The environment that had concealed the mountain now hindered the search. Cloud layers shifted unpredictably across Ross Island. Visibility fluctuated between clear and opaque within minutes. Pilots scanned the white terrain below, knowing that wreckage could blend into the landscape almost perfectly. The scale of the region complicated efforts further. Vast expanses of ice broken only by mountain ridges and frozen inlets. Hours into the operation, a search aircraft spotted dark fragments scattered across a slope. The location was unmistakable. The lower flanks of Mount Erebus. Confirmation of the crash transformed uncertainty into the largest peacetime disaster in New Zealand's aviation history. News traveled quickly across the country, followed by a period of collective shock. Many of those aboard were well-known figures in their communities. Families, professionals, retirees, and airline staff participating in what had been presented as a safe excursion. Recovery operations faced extraordinary obstacles. The crash site lay at high altitude on steep terrain exposed to extreme winds and sub-zero temperatures. Helicopter access was limited by thin air and unpredictable weather. Ground teams required specialized equipment for movement across ice and volcanic rock, concealed beneath snow. Personnel from New Zealand, the United States, and Antarctic research programs collaborated in a complex logistical effort. Their objective was not rescue. Survival had been impossible, but recovery and investigation. Conditions on the mountain changed rapidly. Sudden storms forced teams to suspend operations repeatedly. Equipment froze. Visibility dropped without warning. Even standing upright became difficult on the icy slopes. Despite these challenges, investigators documented the debris field methodically. The distribution of wreckage indicated that the aircraft had impacted the mountain in controlled flight at high speed. Engines showed evidence of power at the moment of collision. There were no signs of in-flight breakup or fire prior to impact. These findings reinforce a conclusion that the aircraft had been functioning normally until the final seconds. Attention turned to the question that defines every accident investigation. Why? Initial reports emphasized pilot error, suggesting that the crew had descended below safe altitude without confirming terrain clearance. This interpretation aligned with a straightforward narrative, a deviation from procedures leading to controlled flight into terrain. However, as investigators examined navigation data and company records, inconsistencies emerged. The program coordinates in the aircraft's inertial navigation system differed from those in the crew's briefing materials. The discrepancy placed the aircraft directly on a path toward Ross Island rather than the intended route east of it. This discovery reframed the investigation. If the crew believed they were following a safe corridor over low terrain, their decision to descend appeared consistent with that understanding. The environment's visual deception compounded the error, preventing recognition of rising ground until it was too late. A formal inquiry was established to examine the chain of events in detail. The proceedings scrutinized operational procedures within Air New Zealand, communication between planners and flight crews, and the broader safety culture surrounding Antarctic sightseeing flights. Testimony revealed that the coordinate change had been implemented without explicit notification to those responsible for executing the flight. The inquiry also explored the limitations of contemporary navigation technology. Inertial systems could guide aircraft with remarkable precision, but they lacked awareness of terrain. Without independent cross-checking against charts or visual confirmation, errors in programmed data could persist undetected. Debate intensified over responsibility. Some officials maintained that pilots ultimately bear authority for terrain clearance. Others argued that systemic failures, incomplete briefings, procedural gaps, and organizational assumptions had placed the crew in an untenable situation. The investigation's findings highlighted the concept of latent error, a condition in which decisions made far removed from the cockpit create hazards that only become apparent under specific circumstances. In this case, a sequence of ordinary administrative actions had aligned with environmental conditions uniquely capable of masking danger. Public reaction reflected both grief and a demand for accountability. Families of the victims sought clarity rather than blame, while aviation professionals examined the implications for future operations. The disaster prompted immediate suspension of Antarctic sightseeing flights. No commercial airline would again carry civilian passengers over the continent in the same manner. The risks, once considered manageable, were now understood as fundamentally unpredictable. Beyond the operational changes, the accident influenced international aviation safety discussions. Controlled flight into terrain remained a leading cause of fatal accidents worldwide. The Erebus disaster demonstrated how modern aircraft could still be vulnerable when technological limitations intersected with human expectation and environmental extremes. Investigators compiled their findings into detailed reports intended not only to explain the past but to prevent recurrence. On the slopes of the mountain, recovery teams completed their work as the Antarctic summer progressed. When winter returned, heavy snow and ice began covering the remaining debris, gradually integrating the site into the landscape. The continent retained the physical evidence, but the lessons would travel far beyond it. In aviation, the final chapter of an accident is not written at the crash site. It is written in procedures revised, technologies improved, and assumptions reconsidered. The destruction of a single aircraft can alter how thousands of others operate, often in ways invisible to passengers who board them years later. The disaster on the slopes of Mount Erebus became one of those defining events. Investigators concluded that the accident could not be understood solely as pilot error or mechanical failure. It represented a systemic breakdown, a chain of small misjudgments and missing safeguards that aligned under rare environmental conditions. The lessons extended beyond Antarctic operations to the global aviation community. One of the most significant outcomes was renewed focus on controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT. At the time, CFIT accidents accounted for a substantial portion of fatal airline crashes worldwide. Aircraft were becoming more reliable mechanically, shifting the primary risk toward navigation, situational awareness, and human factors. The Erebus disaster demonstrated how even experienced crews could be misled when instruments, procedures, and perception diverged. Attention turned to technological solutions. Ground proximity warning systems, already in service on many aircraft, underwent critical reassessment. Earlier versions reacted only when terrain closure rates became dangerous, providing minimal time for recovery. Engineers began developing enhanced systems capable of anticipating terrain conflicts earlier by integrating altitude, speed, and configuration data. These improvements would eventually evolve into terrain awareness and warning systems that displayed digital terrain maps in real time, a capability absent in 1979. Procedural changes accompanied technological advances. Airlines strengthened requirements for cross-verification of navigation data. Flight crews were encouraged, and later required, to compare program coordinates against independent sources, rather than relying solely on dispatch inputs. Pre-flight briefings incorporated explicit confirmation of route changes, especially for operations in remote or high-risk environments. The concept of crew resource management also gained renewed urgency. CRM emphasizes communication, shared decision-making, and challenge response behavior within the cockpit. It encourages all crew members to question assumptions and voice concerns, even in hierarchical structures where deference to authority had previously discouraged such interaction. Although CRM had been introduced earlier in the decade, accidents like Erebus underscored its necessity. Aviation culture gradually shifted from individual command toward collaborative verification. Organizational accountability became another focus. The inquiry highlighted how decisions made far from the cockpit could shape outcomes in critical moments. Airlines reevaluated how information flowed between departments, recognizing that safety depends on transparency as much as technical competence. Documentation practices improved. Change management procedures became more rigorous, ensuring that modifications to routes or systems were communicated clearly to those responsible for execution. For New Zealand, the impact extended beyond aviation. The loss affected communities across the country, binding them in a shared experience of grief. Memorials were established, not as dramatic monuments, but as quiet spaces for reflection. The disaster entered national memory as a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. Commercial sightseeing flights to Antarctica ceased permanently. The continent returned to its role as a domain of scientific exploration rather than tourism. Aircraft continued to operate there, but under stricter protocols developed through collaboration between nations maintaining research stations on the ice. Over time, the physical traces of the crash on the mountain diminished. Snow accumulation and glacial movement softened the contours of the site. From a distance, nothing distinguished the slope from the rest of the volcanic landscape. The lessons, however, remained embedded in training manuals, cockpit procedures, and regulatory frameworks around the world. Modern airliners now carry systems capable of displaying terrain even in complete darkness or cloud cover. Satellite navigation provides continuous positional accuracy unimaginable in the era of inertial systems alone. Yet the fundamental principle reinforced by the disaster endures. Technology cannot replace disciplined verification. Accidents often arise not from a single catastrophic mistake, but from the gradual erosion of safety margins, a process so subtle it becomes invisible until conditions expose it. The flight that ended on Mount Erebus began as a routine operation, supported by capable aircraft, professional crew, and established procedures. Its legacy lies in the recognition that routine can conceal risk when assumptions go unchallenged. Today, aircraft crossing remote regions carry the accumulated knowledge of past tragedies. Pilots are trained to question instruments when they conflict with expectation, to distrust visual illusions, and to treat unfamiliar environments with heightened caution. These practices form an invisible memorial to those lost. On clear days, Mount Erebus remains visible for hundreds of miles, its plume rising into the polar sky. Research aircraft occasionally pass at high altitude, maintaining wide separation from its slopes. From above, the volcano appears isolated, surrounded by the immense emptiness of Antarctica. There is no visible marker of the disaster
This
from that
chart
distance,
shows the
only a
terrain
mountain,
profile for
a continent,
stabilized
and the
approach.
quiet understanding that
Right.
safety
We
in aviation
cross-checked
is
with
written
the
in memory as much as in
EGWS
metal
to
and
avoid
code.
CFIT.
The story does not end with the impact. It continues each time an aircraft navigates safely through conditions that once proved fatal, guided by procedures shaped in the aftermath of loss, sustained by the determination that such events should remain singular in history rather than repeated. Silence, in this case, is not emptiness. It is the sound of lessons learned.